Before we begin tonight, we have some questions that came in by email since we last met, which summarize neatly much of the material we've been covering, so I thought I would share these with you. The first question is, does Sri Aurobindo mean that we use belief as an agency of mind until we know the capital K through a profound experiential realization that mind, reason, is the tool we use until we get beyond that? Do we go from belief to true knowledge? And indeed, just as we chanted, we move from darkness to light. The mind is not an agency of truth. It goes out and gathers data, it reasons about it, it measures, it divides, it assesses. But mind itself is not native to the truth consciousness. So mind is one of the terms of existence through which we evolve as we ascend back to true knowledge. It is a power of consciousness. It is not consciousness itself. So it isn't that we discard mind as we outgrow it, it's that it assumes its proper placement. It is a tool of truth and not a surveyor of truth. A second question is, what is the sign of being there? Is it mental equanimity? I think the first question is, assigned to whom? For the one who holds the realization, the sign is needless, because a sign is an interpretative device, no? It's an external figuration. But the Gita, for instance, records the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. And at some point, Arjuna poses the question, what is the nature of the one who has this realization? How does he stand? How does he walk? How does he sit? And Krishna's answer is quite revealing, because all the criteria are inner. Is the person governed by peace? Is the person always aware of Brahman? Now I'm beginning to paraphrase. But for the person who has achieved to expect that power of realization would change all aspects of the vehicle which carries that consciousness is an impossibility. We have not seen that yet in anyone. The idea that the realization will completely remake the adhara is what we are striving for. To make consciousness count when it comes to matter is a whole question of transformation. Transformation follows upon realization. First, one must realize, that is, live in the constant awareness that everything is Brahman. That is the first truth of your experience. Everything else derives from that. So, at core, your heart might flutter when a thief points a gun at your head and says, hand over your cash. But the spirit inside is unmoved and equal to all things. as that moves more and more into mind and heart and flesh, there is less and less reaction to it. But that does not mean that the being cannot be dynamic. It does not mean that there are areas which have undergone greater transformation than remaining areas. It is a progressive movement. So the sign that you are there is that you know you are there because you have become that. There is no further question. It was charming in a way that people used to go to the mother and say, am I in the psychic consciousness? Psychic doesn't mean what it means to most people in the West. Psychic, in the terminology that Mother used, referred to the psyche, the nature of the soul. If you have to ask if you're in the psychic consciousness, you are not in the psychic consciousness. It is an unmistakable experience. It is possible to experience the divine at the core of your own being, to discover the divine in the universe around, to live in the transcendent nature of the divine. Transcendence, universality, and at the core, the individual divinity are all one and the same. There is no separable difference in them, among them. There was another question too. What is faith's relationship to enthusiasm? Well, last week we talked about the divine frenzy, divino furore in Latin. That is enthusiasmos in Greek, and it means God-inspired zeal, and it is what lies at the core of our being. Both faith, which is this soul-based certitude, which is beyond mental conviction, and enthusiasm, the spark, the flame power, which is reflected dynamically through the heart, are both powers of this soul which manifests dynamically in the nature, body, life, and mind. So when we say enthusiasm may dwell primarily in the soul, but it finds some part of the being that's open to it and radiates through it, catches it on fire. And faith sustains us, both in heart and in mental conviction, through the vicissitudes of life, but hails primarily from within. Faith is a knowledge that has not found its name and form outside yet. It is looking for that. It feels it present in the world and knows that whatever path it takes, that path must eventually lead to that realization. And all the mockery and skepticism of the world cannot warn it off its mission. It will continue. Even if it seems to be dampened in the moment, it will come back resurgent and carry you forward, because it is your soul speaking. So, very good questions, and they set the stage for this next chapter, which we start now. It's the 7th chapter in the Life Divine, the ego and the dualities. If we could make note briefly, this issue appeared on the 15th of February in 1915. About a week later, Mira Althassa Richard, who we came to know later as the mother, left for France with her husband Paul Richard. They were forced to go back because Paul Richard had got involved with all sorts of unsavory characters while he was in Pondicherry, including this Indian sage named Sri Aurobindo. And the British, being very concerned, put all the pressure they could upon the French government there to see if they couldn't get them out of Pondicherry. And the device was the First World War. Paul Richard was called to serve. And to do that, he had to go back to France. So by that artifice, both the mother, if I may, and Paul Richard left just after her birthday. She said later that she left her soul in Pondicherry. She said she never left Sri Aurobindo. Her body went back to France, but she remained in Pondicherry with him. After they are back in France, the French edition of the aria, of which the Life Divine was released serially along with other articles, was seized, and only the English version came out. And the French subscribers agreed to receive the English version. They must have choked to say that. Sri Aurobindo was then left all by himself in Pondicherry to produce 64 pages of philosophy, as he said, by his lonely self. This was one of the last chapters that he wrote while they were present. So the ego and the dualities. Ego, by the way, is a word that both in Latin and in Greek simply means I, the sense of I-ness. There are many different kinds of philosophies that interpret the ego in different ways. But in the sense that Sri Aurobindo regards it, we'll find that his is a far richer connotation than most. As always, he opens the 7th chapter with a motto drawn from the Vedic heritage. And this one comes again from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which means the white-horsed one. The soul, seated on the same tree of nature, is absorbed and deluded and has sorrow, because it is not the Lord. But when it sees and is in union with that other self, and greatness of it which is the Lord, then sorrow passes away from it. This verse is from chapter 4. It's the 7th verse. It is part of a pair of verses which are next to each other in the Shvetashvatara. I'm going to read the first verse as well, which occurs in the Mundaka Upanishad at 3.1.1, and then what we just read at 3.1.2. Two birds, beautiful of wing, close companions, cling to a common tree. Of the two, one eats the sweet fruit of the tree, the other eats not, but watches his fellow. The soul seated on the same tree of nature is absorbed and deluded, and has sorrow because it is not the Lord, Anisha. But when it sees and is in union with that other self and greatness of it, which is the Lord, Isha, then sorrow, Shoka, passes away from it. This comes from the Rig Veda, in the first mandala, the 164th hymn. The idea is that there is a world tree, Vriksha, and the two birds represent the dynamic nature of the soul involved in the universe, tasting fruit which might be sweet, might be bitter, but engrossed in the play. The other bird represents the higher self. They are really the same. So one seems to be coursing through the world, hopping from limb to limb, no perch ever being permanent, going from sadness to happiness, and becomes bewildered. And then, in its state of bewilderment, it feels something watching it, and it turns its gaze upward, and it sees its other half gazing back at it, and then it knows. The one is calm, as equanimity, equality, samatha, is uninvolved, is sovereign. The lower self, the other bird that's engaged, now, because he sees what he is, assumes that sovereignty in nature. And then the tree becomes doubly beautiful, because whether the experience is sweet or bitter, this is the world tree. And one is also sovereign and Lord at the same time that one participates in the play. And so too are we. When we think we're just this little thing hopping from experience to experience, we're limited by our self-conception. When we see that of which we are a part and a radiant representation, then we experience freedom. We experience delight. No longer merely pleasure and pain. Now we have ananda. So, since we've looked at this motto and seen that it's come to us from the Rig Veda, through the Upanishads, of course it continues on from there. This is part of a great Vedantic tradition which affirms life. Now let us see what we do with this figure of the small self and its experience of the dualities of pleasure and pain. Sri Aurobindo begins. If all is in truth Satchit Ananda, death, suffering, evil, limitation can only be the creations, positive in practical effect, negative in essence, of a distorting consciousness which has fallen from the total and unifying knowledge of itself into some error of division and partial experience. This is the fall of man typified in the poetic parable of the Hebrew Genesis. That fall is his deviation from the full and pure acceptance of God in himself, or rather of God in himself, into a dividing consciousness which brings with it all the train of the dualities, life and death, good and evil, joy and pain, completeness and want, the fruit of a divided being. This is the fruit which Adam and Eve, Purusha and Prakriti, the soul tempted by nature, have eaten. The redemption comes by the recovery of the universal in the individual and of the spiritual term in the physical consciousness. Then alone the soul and nature can be allowed to partake of the fruit of the tree of life and be as the divine and live forever. For then only can the purpose of its descent into material consciousness be accomplished. When the knowledge of good and evil, joy and suffering, life and death has been accomplished through the recovery by the human soul of a higher knowledge, which reconciles and identifies these opposites in the universal and transforms their divisions into the image of the divine unity. So we come back again to this central idea of Sat Chit Ananda. Sat, a word that means sheer, pure being. Chit, consciousness. Ananda, delight, bliss. We saw that this is a term that does not derive in the Vedanta very early. Actually, it comes much later, well after 1000 CE. But it does typify for us the purest expression in a single term of what Vedanta is trying to say. That on the basis of this pure conscious being and this ebullience of its self-experience as delight comes the manifestation of the universe and the individual within the universe. Individual and universe and transcendence all are part of the divine nature. That divine nature may lapse from all formulation of positive being into an unnameable non-being. But we can call it non-being only in the sense that it can't be captured or fulfilled only by the positive statement that being is and becoming arises from being. It is free even from its own self-willed manifestation. So, if Sat Chit Ananda then is all this, then death and suffering and all the rest of the things that are listed here are experienceable to the soul involved in nature. They are real because they are positive in practical effect, that is to say, they stand out as evident terms of existence, but they are negative in essence, as he writes, because in essence they don't have any separate reality, no reality of their own. Because if that were true, if there were death on its own within Sat Chit Ananda, then Sat Chit Ananda could die. But it is, by definition, pure, unmitigated being, unabrogated in any direction, unmeasurable in any temporal extension. He writes here that this is the fall of man, this fall into a divided experience, and equates it with Purusha and Prakriti, Adam and Eve. The conceit of that is interesting, but we won't pursue it. The sentence that begins, "The redemption comes by the recovery of the universal in the individual." This is an important sentence, because we experience privation when we are not part of the whole. The idea of the individual as being separate from the universe, as somehow being derivable outside of the context of the all, is impossible to be. But if we live in that sense, then we live in a self-imposed fiction. Self-imposed if we persist in it. It seems natural as we arise out of ignorance and course upwards towards knowledge. Then the sense of egoity comes into being. We suddenly discover that I am. I can say I, and that is other. As we move upwards and begin to think, we can reflect about that. The ego comes into being when we think of such dualistic terms. But it doesn't define the real self, because the real self is always at one with the universe and with that from which it descends, as he'll say directly. So we must find the universe in ourselves and find ourselves in the universe, and we must also find the spiritual term of existence, that is, that which is eternal, that which is immaculate and unchangeable, in the very tissues of matter. If we fail to find the spiritual essence behind the apparent becoming, then we'll always be lost in the becoming, just as when we're the bird leaping from limb to limb, we've forgotten about the context of the whole tree. The vriksha has been lost to us. The higher self has been lost to us. We must assume both these larger poises of being. We must become vast in nature. We must become cosmic. And we must transcend all, including individual and cosmos, and be reconcilable back into that emarginate being which is pure and vast and unmanifest. So key to this is unification that leads us out of division. To continue with Sri Aurobindo's next paragraph, to Satchit Ananda, extended in all things in widest commonality and impartial universality, death, suffering, evil, and limitation can only be at the most reverse terms, shadow forms of their luminous opposites. So this is a little subtle. And let's first deal with the word commonality. If you're not familiar with it, it just means the general body of the people. So in other words, Satchit Ananda expressed widely. But remember Satchit Ananda as an impartial positive expression of the absolute. So it is beyond dualities. So as it manifests, it can include these other things as shadow forms of their luminous opposites. And so both pairs, the good, the evil, death, eternity, and life, all come from this same Satchidananda. So he continues, as these things are felt by us, and he's referring to the shadow forms, they are notes of a discord. And of course, this goes back to our very first chapter yet again, that all problems in life are problems of harmony. If we contextualize, if we get to the vastest possible perspective, or a perspective if you prefer, then all these apparent opposites disappear. They are no longer in opposition. They formulate separation where there should be a unity, miscomprehension where there should be an understanding, an attempt to arrive at independent harmonies where there should be a self-adaptation to the orchestral whole. The sense of the whole is lost in the particular. If that's all we experience, we try, through the mind's effort, to reconstruct a larger unity, a harmony of the known elements. But we can't do that, because the mind can't recover unity, really. It can aspire for it. What we ought to do is to meld ourselves back, impliedly through the soul, into the orchestral whole. Then we're not trying to be masters of the universe to create a harmony. Instead, we're according ourselves to the already ongoing harmony. All totality, he writes, even if it be only in one scheme of the universal vibrations, even if it be only a totality of the physical consciousness without possession of all that is in movement beyond and behind, must be, to that extent, a reversion to harmony and a reconciliation of jarring opposites. On the other hand, to Satchidananda, transcendent of the forms of the universe, the dual terms themselves, even so understood, can no longer be justly applicable. Transcendence transfigures. It does not reconcile, but rather transmutes opposites into something surpassing them that effaces their oppositions. So we learn that various totalities are possible, all of them tending to harmony. So we can reach a kind of totality at the physical level. We can reach a totality at the pranic or vital level. We can reach a totality at the level of the mind. There's actually one universe which consumes, subordinates all those within its own being. But any one of these terms is a greater aspect than what we get when we're only in the limited individual. But should we move towards the transcendence, overstepping universality, well, that transfigures. It doesn't reconcile. It's not dealing with the oppositions anymore, but somehow they disappear into something else. And here, too, is a connotation that he'll take up momentarily, because is it possible for that transcendence to manifest in terms of space and time, in the universe per se? And a question for later is the transformation of transcendence. We'll see. At first, however, we must strive to relate the individual again to the harmony of the totality. There, it is necessary for us, otherwise there is no issue from the problem, to realize that the terms in which our present consciousness renders the values of the universe, though practically justified for the purposes of human experience and progress, are not the sole terms in which it is possible to render them, and may not be the complete, the right, the ultimate formulas. Just as there may be sense organs or formations of sense capacity which see the physical world differently, and it may well be better because more completely than our sense organs and sense capacity, so there may be other mental and supramental envisagings of the universe which surpass our own. So we have, as aspirants, to recognize that the safe shores that we're familiar with are not sufficient to us if we're going to go voyage through the ocean. We have to be willing to leave them behind. The shallow waters are left for the deeper waters. And how we think the universe works is a patterning of the mind that we have to be willing to set aside. The paradigms with which we have worked, we have to be willing to tear up, or to see them progressively replaced and revised, enlarged. So he introduces again the term supramental here. So there may be other mental and supramental envisagings of the universe which surpass our own. Again, he invites us to move from a mental perspective to something which is supramental, beyond the mind. If the mind is the tool of division, if duality appears to the mind, if there's a me and a you, a good and a bad, a fair and a foul, then what is the experience of the supramental? He hasn't defined that for us yet, but he has equated it in earlier mentionings with a divine consciousness that is capable of living in transcendental unity, and yet mastering and expressing in terms of harmony all the various stadia of experience. So whether the stadium is matter, or the stadium is life, or the stadium is the mind, the supramental is not merely present, but secretly sovereign over it. And just as we have evolved out of matter through life and into mind, where we have found plenty of confusions, so we might evolve out of mind into the supramental, where we rediscover harmony, totality, and the disappearance of the opposites. At least they are no longer enemies. If they are different poles of the same being, that's a different matter, isn't it? We are not trying to annihilate nature, but to fulfill it, to bring out the hidden delight, consciousness, and power nascent in it. So, I think we've come to the paragraph that says, at first, however, we must strive to relate the individual again to the harmony of the totality. There, it is necessary for... Oh, have I already read that?
Yes, read that.
Okay. Yes, now, states of consciousness? Okay, thank you. States of consciousness there are, in which death is only a change in immortal life. Pain, a violent backwash of the waters of universal delight. Limitation, a turning of the infinite upon itself. Evil, a circling of the good around its own perfection. And this, not in abstract conception only, but in actual vision and in constant and substantial experience. So we arrive at a larger consciousness and therefore a larger experience. And when he says this is perhaps sounding abstract to us, that it can be experienced in this way, this is his experience. This is native to his own life. To arrive at such states of consciousness may, for the individual, be one of the most important and indispensable steps of his progress towards self-perfection, because consciousness deeds power. To be able to rise into this state in which all these various arenas of consciousness are at once in play in you, lends to you a power which can affect a true and basic alteration to one's experience of nature, so that the ideal of a self-perfection can come to fruit. What self-perfection would mean is not simply the simple awareness of the soul inside, or the recognition that the universe is a direct expression and manifestation of divine being, which also may dominate our experience. What it means, self-perfection, is that all of these states of realization would have expressive play in every area and corner of our life. Self-perfection would mean self-mastery. It would mean that the body would shine with a divine light. That it would, in a sense, be aware to the cellular level of its own divinity. That the life force in us would be aware of its immortality. That the mind in us would be aware that it is an agency of a larger truth consciousness. And all of them aware that they are part of a special formation in which the individual here and the individual there are working in concert to express what that divine being is everywhere as well as in us. So these individuals arriving at self-perfection would become themselves engines by which the rest of the world would find avenues to self-perfection. You yourself become a light kindling other lights. You yourself become a path upon which other people stride and go beyond your realizations. You become a greater servitor in the world because you are one with it and feel it and know it. So now the next paragraph. Certainly, the practical values given us by our senses and by the dualistic sense mind must hold good in their field and be accepted as the standard for ordinary life experience until a larger harmony is ready into which they can enter and transform themselves without losing hold of the realities which they represent. To enlarge the sense faculties without the knowledge that would give the old sense values their right interpretation from the new standpoint might lead to serious disorders and incapacities, might unfit for practical life and for the orderly and disciplined use of the reason. Equally, an enlargement of our mental consciousness out of the experience of the egoistic dualities into an unregulated unity with some form of total consciousness might easily bring about a confusion and incapacity for the active life of humanity in the established order of the world's relativities. This, no doubt, is the root of the injunction imposed in the Gita on the man who has the knowledge not to disturb the life basis and thought basis of the ignorant. For, impelled by his example, but unable to comprehend the principle of his action, they would lose their own system of values without arriving at a higher foundation. So this is all about the premature expansion of our sense faculties and of our enlarged mind when we aren't ripe for it. In other words, to catapult ourselves into a higher state of consciousness and then not find the means by which to integrate it into our ordinary life leads to an imbalance. Now, it's true that one might inwardly be free, be living in a state of unity beyond measure. The ideal of the Balavat, the child in Indian spirituality and mysticism, is well known. That the person attains this larger consciousness and then roams about almost as a divine madman, doing as he pleases, acting like a wise man one minute, an idiot the next, being ungovernable in his passions, etc. But inwardly, he has that experience of the infinite, and it's rolling through him constantly, but he cannot govern it. To one who aspires at self-perfection, one should be able to hold an entire ocean of ananda, of delight, and not have to even allow a smile to betray itself upon your face, if the will is to simply retain it. In other words, to be able to enjoy and govern the experience. To be able to keep one's balance and not get knocked off one's plate is a sign of self-perfection. Not realization necessarily, but of self-perfection. So in this, Sri Aurobindo is saying that a person who has this power to demonstrate the nature of spiritual realization should not lead people prematurely into that. It can be destructive. If a person isn't ready for it, they can be knocked off base and perhaps not recover that spiritual possibility in that life. One has to be careful. And so the Bhagavad Gita does say, don't take away a person's faith. By showing them a truth of a philosophy that's beyond their digestion, you've done them no good. You've hurt them. So you have to be careful. You have to be really attuned if you're in a situation where you feel provoked, as I know some have, and you want to tell the person opposite that their philosophy is inadequate, and you want to show them in detail why it is so. That if you take that away from them, what will they stand on? So the larger kindness might be to find a more agreeable way to discuss and to invite, rather than impose. I don't know if I've already mentioned it, but the citation in the Bhagavad Gita is in the 3rd chapter, in the 26th verse. So, such a disorder, Sri Aurobindo writes, and incapacity may be accepted personally and are accepted by many great souls as a temporary passage or as the price to be paid for the entry into a wider existence. Now this is something different. This is about being willing to cross the threshold into new arena of action. And of course, one may not be able to accept the terms of that contract immediately. One may have to adjust. One may have to learn how to absorb and assimilate the larger experience and get accustomed to it, and it will eventually become second nature. This is something that Roberto Assagioli noted in his work in psychosynthesis. If you know who he was a contemporary of Freud's and Jung's. Freud was dealing with the unconscious in one sense. Jung greatened the sense of what the unconscious was. Assagioli wrote about the superconscious and was aware of yoga, etc. And often noted that when people were having these, what we could call transpersonal experiences that vaulted you out of the sense of the ego into the universal or something still more sublime, that they were disorienting. And sometimes came after a period where one was in great inner crisis. So the crisis was like living as a moth might in a chrysalis before it is allowed to come out and become the butterfly. So the circumstances of one's life squeeze or suffocate. And somehow you find a release out of it into a greater status of being. And for that period, until you become accustomed to the light, you're blinded. But it can be a rather brief period. One can make a rapid assimilation, become accustomed to that air, move in a more lustrous region, and that become your normal awareness, and your consciousness has been raised. What that means is not that you live above the body, but that really your consciousness is larger, because it becomes more inclusive as well. Your thoughts are far more intuitive, your sight more penetrating, your heart vaster, your physical instincts more refined and precise. All the values of life have changed, but it was preceded by a period of turmoil, etc. Now it's very interesting that Sri Aurobindo notes this, because in his early realizations, this was not the case. Because when he attained nirvana in 1908, simply sitting on the roof and following instructions from Lele to stop the process of the mind, he could immediately, in that vast consciousness, return to the field of politics, write essays, speak spontaneously in front of hundreds and thousands and never had difficulty in assimilating that into a new poise in life. Remarkable. But the right goal of human progress must be always an effective and synthetic reinterpretation by which the law of that wider existence may be represented in a new order of truths and in a more just and puissant working of the faculties on the life material of the universe. For the senses, the sun goes round the earth. That was for them the center of existence, and the motions of life were arranged on the basis of a misconception. The truth is the very opposite, but its discovery would have been of little use if there were not a science that makes the new conception the center of a reasoned and ordered knowledge, putting their right values on the perceptions of the senses. So also for the mental consciousness, God moves round the personal ego, and all his works and ways are brought to the judgment of our egoistic sensations, emotions, and conceptions, and are there given values and interpretations which, though a perversion and inversion of the truth of things, are yet useful and practically sufficient in a certain development of human life and progress. In other words, we see God in terms of our current selves, simply projected more largely. They are a rough, practical systematization of our experience of things, valid so long as we dwell in a certain order of ideas and activities. But they do not represent the last and highest state of human life and knowledge. Truth is the path and not the falsehood. Interestingly, this is a paraphrase of another passage from an Upanishad, again from the Mundaka Upanishad, 3:1-7. Satyam eva jayate, nanritam. Truth, verily, conquers, not falsehood. We often see it in, I think it is one of the slogans popular in India, Satyam eva jayate. Truth verily conquers. But it isn't often remembered that it says nanritam afterwards. Not falsehood. The truth is not that God moves round the ego as the center of existence and can be judged by the ego in its view of the dualities, but that the divine is itself the center, and that the experience of the individual only finds its own true truth when it is known in the terms of the universal and the transcendent. So, the ego defines God in terms which are natural to it. It sees God as itself, just bigger. It sees the God as outside itself, and it's looking for it. But it can't find either its own truth or the truth of the divine looking for it in that way, because it has to be able to experience that the divine is the center of everything, the center of self, the center of universe, the center of all being. There is nothing in which the divine cannot be discovered and experienced. So individual, cosmic, transcendent, all part of that. All part of that. Just as in the Mandukya Upanishad, a different one, the various states of Brahman are described. The waking world, the conceptive world of the superconscious, that deep, sleepless state of consciousness in which there is no self and no other, and then a fourth, a turiya, which is beyond all these and yet encompasses all these. That's the divine. It is all this, and yet it exceeds every formulation. So it is a centerless center of everything. And if I can reach a couple of thousand years later into Giordano Bruno, maybe I'll save that. Nevertheless, to substitute this conception for the egoistic without an adequate base of knowledge may lead to the substitution of new but still false and arbitrary ideas for the old, and bring about a violent instead of a settled disorder of right values. Such a disorder often marks the inception of new philosophies and religions and initiates useful revolutions. And there are many, quote, enlightened beings who misunderstand the nature of their own experience because the ego has not become subjugated to the essential experience of the Atman or Brahman, and then simply blow up their picture of the ego into a world model and interpret all through that. And we could name names. But the true goal is only reached when we can group around the right central conception a reasoned and effective knowledge in which the egoistic life shall rediscover all its values transformed and corrected. Then we shall possess that new order of truths which will make it possible for us to substitute a more divine life for the existence which we now lead, and to effectualize a more divine and puissant use of our faculties on the life material of the universe. So what he's posing here is that there can be a stage of our progressive development in which the mental and the supramental can work together and fuse and offer a world model which reflects the actual values of reality. So that the picture, the worldview that we then experience is consonant with the universe, with that from which the universe comes. And this takes us back to something elemental to Sri Aurobindo, which is that it is certainly the route to the most secure knowledge that by using our own consciousness, we can exceed the formulas of physical science and come to experience reality as it is. And this is the foundation of his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. That real being, which is consciousness, which is power, which is delight, can be discovered within our own consciousness because they are cognate, they are the same. Because they are one, we can see what really is if we get behind the determinations of consciousness to true essential consciousness itself. And living and acting from that, we can transform life. Because this consciousness is one with the universe and is one with our souls, if we come to know that consciousness, we know therefore the universe. And we know what our role is in it. We are not mystified by what our mission might be in the world. We know securely. We act as it is appropriate. I don't know that we can go beyond that. It's already a little after 8 o'clock. So I think we'll put a pause at this juncture, and next week take up the paragraph that begins, that new life and power. And since we've gone on for quite a while, perhaps we should go straight for meditation this evening. What do you say? Namaste, Jai Ma.